week 68 of our weekly discussions. And the topic for today is great power conflicts, putting some special tension on the current crisis in Ukraine and asking at the end, what can we do about this? How can we affect this situation? And at the onset of this, I have to confess, I'm not an expert in this. I just really want to guide us into a discussion about this so that we can all learn from each other and walk away from this call with a better idea of this whole broader problem, which is something that many have talked about for a while, but especially about the current situation in Ukraine, just gain understanding of this situation and to the extent that we can come closer to helping those who are involved. So we are the Christians in the EA community, and we're committed to serving others as well as possible, drawing on ideas from EA, and we inspire and equip others to do likewise. So we're talking about great power conflicts. What do I mean by a great power conflict? And by this, I mean a large, violent conflict between major powers, such as the US or Russia or China, and especially conflicts that could result in devastating events, perhaps even the death of hundreds of millions or billions of people in the worst case. But of course, conflicts don't just involve completely existentially catastrophic events. They also involve many quote unquote minor events, or maybe like not as flashy events. Growing mistrust between major nations makes it really hard for these nations to coordinate. Makes it more difficult for many values that we'll talk about in a moment to flourish. And there's a lot of attention that great power conflicts gets. Of course, in history, here's an image of the 30 Years' War, which is one of the most notable wars in Europe back, I believe, in the 1600s, which wiped out about 20% of the European population at the time. And there's been lots of studying within academia about conflicts across political science, international relations, history, many different departments. And I want to try to look at this today a little bit through an EA lens, looking at this through themes of tractability, neglectedness, importance, also looking at the Ukraine conflict. But yeah, in general, when we're talking about great power conflicts, we mean more or greater focus on a few key players, especially the US, Russia, and China, but also other powers, including EU, the EU and its various member states, and various nuclear weapons holding states, especially North Korea. One thing that I think needs to be said, one thing that isn't said enough in our news, is that deaths from war over time have been falling quite drastically. So if you look at yearly deaths, it's just gone down considerably. And we live by many standards in the most peaceful time in human history. And that's something that doesn't quite make the news. If you've read Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, he talks about this. Many others talk about this, especially in progress studies. And I think this is a cause to be hopeful, even in the present crisis. While it might not always be the most tactful thing to say to somebody who's been hurt from the current crisis, it is good to remind ourselves at the end of the day that we do have this peace to be thankful for, and we are living in a relatively peaceful and safe time. But it needs to also be said that nowadays there's much greater destructive potential. And when we look back ever since the dropping of the bomb, we've entered an age where existential threats are considerably more likely. The risk of wars that completely annihilate populations as a whole, or even humanity as a whole, that's something that beforehand was something hard to imagine, and now it's a risk that's on everybody's mind. I have here just the estimated overall nuclear stockpiles since the end of the war to now. And of course, we reached a peak in the Cold War, and we've been de-escalating ever since. But we still have over 10,000 nuclear warheads, and last time I read, more than enough to wipe out all major cities in the world. So we're still in an age with existential risk, especially ones that emerge from great power conflicts. And it's not just lives that are at stake from from these conflicts. It's also other values that we care about, things like justice, people being treated respectfully and being given what they're due. Things like freedom, the lack of freedom that emerges from these conflicts, whether that's by way of poverty or by way of international sanction or just restrictions on freedom. These are things that affect people and their rights and their freedoms in a profound way. Also, people's economic well-being. So many people, just thinking of the current conflict, have been tremendously affected. Looking at the at Ukraine and also at Russia, this is just a catastrophic impact on their economies, and also the well-being aspects that are correlated with economic well-being and putting bread on the table. Also, just cultural understanding and peace. The more we have power conflicts between nations, the more there tends to be misunderstanding and mistrust and friction between people of those nations. And to the extent that we have that, we live in a world where people have animosity towards each other, and where culture tends to follow in a direction where we don't treat other people as human beings, and we don't view our fellow man as brothers and sisters, and as fellow children of God, really. But there's also this future generational aspect where great power conflicts, and especially both their temporal risks, but also their existential risks, threaten future generations. If you restrict people's freedom and also their economic prosperity today, it doesn't just restrict it today, but it does leave an impact on institutions in the next generation. And same thing with an existential risk. I mean, if we end the human race from some kind of nuclear exchange, that's not just something that impacts everybody who is alive today. That's so much lost potential from everyone who would have been. So I have here just some updates from the conflict in Ukraine. I'm not an expert in this. I follow the news though, and I imagine all of you follow the news too. So here's just a screenshot I found on the New York Times this morning showing the current advance and where Russian forces are now. And some headlines that are being discussed are whether NATO and the US should continue to pursue a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And my understanding is that means by no-fly zone that NATO and US forces will not be flying over Ukraine during this conflict. And the reason being the risk of some kind of escalation into a much worse war. But there's also ongoing protests in Russia for which people are being arrested. There's the continued pain of the Ukrainian people who are suffering innocently under this attack. There's the continued exit of millions of Ukrainians into other states in Europe, including Poland, especially Poland. And there's just this waiting for resolution through diplomatic means, but also this anticipation of things possibly becoming worse. So how can people help? Well, the common EA ways to think about helping in effective ways is to help through donations. We know in many other cause areas that donations can be extremely effective if directed at if directed at the right organizations. We know in the poverty and health space that this is true. Perhaps this could be true in the current crisis. That's something I'd love to discuss. In terms of career, there are obviously careers that deal with great power conflicts and the situation in Ukraine. There are also ways you can use your time to help humanitarian efforts. And then there are also ways you can advocate for effective solutions or use your voice, whether that's soliciting your lawmakers or sharing on social media. So I'd love to discuss these, especially in light of the current conflict, what we can do to help. I want to quote just two people who have thoughts on this, more thoughts than I do, at least. And one is from Alex Bereznoy. I probably butchered his last name. I know Alex from EA Anywhere, which, by the way, is another group like EA for Christians, mostly online events for a global community, though not necessarily for Christians, but just for general EAs. And Alex is Russian. He's not in Russia right now, but he has currently the highest voted comment on the EA forum, how to support Ukraine right now effectively. And his solution is to support free press and nonprofits combating political persecution in Russia. The reason being that Russian propaganda works very well. And right now, it takes incredible bravery to speak out against that propaganda, as thousands of people are being arrested. And he mentions Meduza as one news aggregator, as well as OVD Info. And then I want to quote here from Kelsey Piper from Vox, who writes the Future Perfect column, which is a sort of EA-aligned column. And she comes to say that, well, these are just really tough questions. How do we help in this current situation, which has the attention of the whole world? And she suggests that one very honest answer is that we should, of course, support the refugees made by the war, and that the most effective ways to do good with limited resources are still the same ones that existed before this crisis. That means addressing long-run challenges that are neglected and ignored, like the fight against child mortality in 4 places, and not necessarily in the hotspot that has temporarily transfixed the world. So some questions for discussion. What do you think are the most pressing ways to support the victims of the war in Ukraine? And do you think this changes cause prioritization from an EA sense? Are you going to change how you spend your time and how you spend your donations to support some of these causes? Also, if you are willing to share, have you or does someone you know have they been personally affected by this war? I'd love to hear from others who may. And any further thoughts that you have on this topic, whether that's about Ukraine or about great power conflicts in general, such as the potential conflict between US and China, among others.